Yeah, a very welcome from my side as well. I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy that you also stay for this last session. As said, I'm going to talk about Scope 3 emissions in expanding enterprises with a focus on the topic of data quality. As many people are usually asking me what actually TransnetBW is doing, I am going to start with the first slide about this. We are a transmission grid operator, so as you can see on this picture, we operate the grid in Germany, especially in Baden-Württemberg, but the grid in Germany is quite interconnected. So we also collaborate with all the other transmission grid operators. And at the moment, one of our key topics is to integrate all the renewables into the energy system. For example, to bring all the renewables from wind energy from the north of Germany or from solar energy from the south of Germany to the places where it will be used in the end. We do have a sustainability strategy since some years and also 5 sustainability goals. However, I won't really go into detail. You can have a look on our sustainability report, but as I also just have like 15 minutes, I'm going to skip that. I just want to let you know that we have this first goal of reducing our climate impact with the sub-goals of being climate or greenhouse gas neutral in Scope 1 and 2 until 2035 and in Scope 3 until 2045. Coming to the emissions of our company and why Scope 3 is quite relevant. Well, the years before, or when we started to do our emission tracking, we found that Scope 2 emissions was the biggest category for us. It made almost all of our emissions. And during the last years, however, we managed to really decrease the emissions in category 1 and 2. If you can see on the slide, even last year, emissions, for example, in category 2 decreased by 45%, which is quite a huge amount. So this is one of the points why Scope 3 becomes more relevant. But at the same time, it's also that Scope 3 emissions are actually rising. And this is, as said, as we are expanding, we also expand our grid. And obviously, this brings a lot of building and emissions that comes by buying all the stuff and building all the stuff. And therefore, I now want to focus on 2 of the reasons that led to this rising emissions, which is one, the expanding of the grid, but also that we found difference in the data quality. And due to recalculation, we also found that our emissions were actually rising, which is obviously not like a real rising over the years, but a rising due to the calculation method. Coming to the point of the grid expansion, as said, we have the sustainability goal to become climate neutral. We want to be climate neutral quite soon also in Scope 2, and therefore we need a climate neutral grid, which will also, I believe, be quite helpful for everyone else if there's no climate emissions in the grid. That will be helpful for all the companies using the electricity in the end. But to get this climate into this climate transition and to really build this grid which should be climate neutral, we do have to spend around 40 billion during the coming years. And obviously, if you spend like 40 billion, that will lead to a lot of emissions because we don't spend it just like, well, I don't really have any examples of spending money which won't lead to any emission increase. And in our case, it will also lead to these emissions. So we have this difficulty that we really want a climate neutral grid and the energy transition, but on the other hand, this will lead to increasing emissions. So we decided for the next few years, even though we have this goal of becoming climate gas neutral, we decided not to look on the absolute emissions in Scope 3, but rather focus on the relative ones, because then we can make sure that for each unit or each asset that we are going to build during the next few years, we manage to really decrease the emissions and to have a positive effect, even though they will be increasing in the first few years. But we also want to take the larger picture into account and really make sure that the emission reduction overweight the emissions that we produce by the grid expansion. Yeah, coming to the point of data quality. For us, it was quite a finding that obviously we started with the hope of really getting a good CO2 balance in the first place. So we really took the SBTi and the greenhouse gas protocol into account, and we started with a materiality analysis and found the 6 categories which appear to be most relevant in our case. And then we even got the help of an external professional company to do the first calculations. And we did this in 2021. And then later, we were not quite sure anymore whether the calculation was actually as good enough as we hoped it would be. So we did a recalculation a bit later. And even though we took exact the same categories into account, we found that we had an increase of 97% of the emissions compared to the first calculation, just because we got more into detail in each of these subcategories. So for us, it was quite a finding. It was partly due to emission factors, but mainly it was really that we divided each category into smaller ones and got better matching emission factors for each category. So this was one of the main findings in recalculation, which I wanted to share with you, because we found that in first place, we were setting up some measures based on our greenhouse gas balance, but we didn't have the right picture for really setting up the right measures. So for us, it was really an eye-opener to do this recalculation and now see that some emission categories like waste have actually decreased, while others like scope 3.1 and 3.2 have increased quite a bit. So we have to actually redo our whole scope 3 emission strategy again. And because we had these findings, we decided to go another step and to also question some other calculations that we also did. And we got a master student who just worked on comparing 2 assets. We also wanted to find out which asset is actually the better one, which should we build in the future. But she didn't just compare these 2 assets, but also she focused on different calculation methods of these assets and compared these as well. This time it wasn't about granularity or going more into detail, but just about whether the material-based or the spend-based calculation method is actually the better one. And we found that going the way with the material-based emission calculation, which was really into detail as well, we didn't just get a better picture, but also we got, again, a higher amount of emissions in the result. And she also found that the more environmentally friendly product led to higher emissions with a spend-based calculation method, which makes sense if you think about it, because quite often environmentally friendly products are more expensive, but which also shows again how the spend-based emission calculation is not really a method that works in bigger companies at least, or that works for setting up good strategies. Yeah, I think this is now the scope 3 calculation that we do have. We still have more subcategories that we take into account. I just couldn't get them all on the slide. I need to say, honestly, there are still some of the subcategories where we need to use the spend-based calculation method because we just we don't have better data at the moment. However, we really try to get all the sub-calculations also with the material-based method. And yeah, as you see on the right side, I put the findings again, that, well, the emission factor really matters, that the calculation method matters, and also that the question how detailed you're going to look into your emission factor really matters. And all of these, in the end, really matter for your strategy as well, because as we found, some of the measures were not as helpful as we thought, because the emissions in those categories were different than we expected in the first place. So I think it's really the first step to be sure that your baseline is really good in order to set up a good strategy and to become climate neutral in the long run. Yeah, to put it all in the nutshell, it's my last slide. It's just to bring it all together. As I said, we found that data quality is really important, and that it's also important to get into detail for each of the emission categories. However, even though if you go into very small details, it's relevant to also take the bigger picture into account. And yes, we are having increasing Scope 3 emissions. However, these increasing emissions for the next few years will lead to a big decrease in emissions in the long run, as we are helping to do the energy transition. And thus, we believe it's still a good way that we're going to take. Yeah. Thanks again for listening. I'm also looking forward to the discussion rounds. Thank you.